I think it might be time to have our conversation or discussion about international responses to the international financial crisis. Thank you so much, or international financial meltdown, or whatever I called it when I made up a name for it. I'm Joe White. I'm the director of the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western, and thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to thank our speakers very much for coming also. As you all know, well, I am used to working on the biggest disasters imaginable. I study the American healthcare system. I study the federal budget. So for most of my life, those have been the biggest disasters imaginable, particularly the American healthcare system. And when I lived in New Orleans, yeah. But now it's no longer true. I can no longer say that of all the people around, I'm studying the biggest mess, because I'm not. And now among my political science department, Elliot, Posner, and Katie Lavelle are studying the biggest disaster imaginable. It seemed obvious that if we were to have a Center for Policy Studies, we should address the biggest disaster imaginable. And it seemed that one of the dimensions that is not discussed enough in the United States is the response of international institutions, the international response, and particularly the response within Europe. Because when the meltdown began, there were indications that the Europeans were handling it, seemed to be handling it by some reports, better than the American political institutions were. And in more recent times, there have been indications that maybe they're not doing much better than we are. With the advice of Professor Posner, we have assembled a really strong group of panelists, all of whom are experts on European financial institutions and European financial regulation. We have Professor Kathleen McNamara, Kate McNamara from Georgetown University. We have Professor Kaltenhaler from the University of Akron. And we have Professor Elliot Posner from Case Western Reserve University. And so Professor McNamara will lead off, and then Professor Posner and Professor Kaltenhaler, or Professor Kaltenhaler and Professor Posner, I guess. And
Karl will go first.
Karl will go first. Kaltenhaler first. We'll have supplementary comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, Kate McNamara, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're very glad to have you here.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here, actually, particularly with two scholars whose work I've really admired over the years and who really are experts in the area of European financial affairs. And also I'm interested to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion in particular, because one thing that really strikes me about the financial crisis is that its effects have been very lumpy, right? Depending on who you are, where you live, what place you are in your life, and so on, you're experiencing it in very different ways, and your kind of perceptions about what's going on and your reactions to it, I think, are really colored by that. And I live inside the Beltway, and I spend most of my time talking to people in Washington, D.C., which in many ways, although we're in the cauldron of the kind of politics and so on, has been actually quite insulated from a lot of the kind of economic effects, right? Because, you know, I'm in the public sector, which is only expanding, so our labor market, our housing market, and so on and so forth has not been impacted as much as, say, here in Cleveland. So we're going to try to leave a good amount of time for conversation, questions, and so on. But I thought what I would do in my time is first sort of describe the crisis as I see it and talk about both its domestic sources and its international factors, and then highlight some of the dynamics of the crisis that I think, for me as somebody who's been studying the politics of money and finance for a long time, I think some of the dynamics that haven't necessarily come out as clearly in a lot of the sort of popular journalism about it. So I'm going to take a brief trip into some more kind of theoretical ideas that I want to share with you that help me think about the nature of the crisis and what we're dealing with. And then finally, I'll move to discussing a little bit the topic of the international responses to the crisis, particularly paying attention actually to the U.S. and to its relationships. And actually, Karl and Elliot are then going to take up more explicitly the question of what the Europeans are up to and whether we might learn from them. So first, let me start by describing the crisis. So obviously, it's common knowledge that the crisis has been rooted in this real estate bubble that we saw in the United States, right? That housing and land prices flew up faster than the rest of the economy over the last 10 years or so at this unsupportable pace, and then the bubble burst. But I think what we really have to remember is that the bubble wasn't made up of drywall and timber and bricks, but rather the rapid expansion of credit. It was really actually the sort of credit side of the economy that actually pushed forward this crisis and brought us to where we are today. Most obviously, this was in the subprime mortgage industry, right? The housing loans given to folks with less than stellar credit records and so on. Banks like Washington Mutual, who were doing these crazy loans willy-nilly to anybody. I think, if you read the New York Times, they've done some incredible stories on what was going on in some of these, with some of these lenders. But it was really much larger than the subprime market, actually, right? We saw the same sorts of things going on in the area of car loans, in the area of credit card debt, and so on. This bundling up of the loans, slicing them into these specific tranches or specific parts, and then selling options in these secondary or derivative markets, right? So you had this sort of all these different arenas where people were sort of extracting purported value out of these loans and then selling various types of derivatives, right? And what really happened over the last 10 years is that activity, that financial activity, really dwarfed what we call the real economy, right? The economy of actually producing things and making tangible goods, right? So we had this array of financial instruments that were derived from the real economy, but were multiplied time and time again, such that they really, the sort of purported value of these assets really completely dwarfed the real economy. So, yeah, everybody turn off your phones. Thank you. So the problem is with the extension of credit, the mechanisms of these various financial markets, but what really happened, right? Why did the party end, right? Why are we all looking at our tragic 401k statements, or for most people not looking at them, right, and throwing them in the trash? Well, it turns out that this is a remarkably old-fashioned, seen-it-before financial crisis that various authors throughout time have actually described quite, I think, correctly in many ways. And I'm going to draw on particularly a wonderful book by Charles Kindleberger, which maybe some of you have read, economic historian, who wrote a book called Manias, Panics, and Crashes, right? Manias, Panics, and Crashes. Where he called financial crises, ever since the advent of capitalism and industrialization of the last couple centuries, to be a hardy perennial, right? The winter comes and everything dies, and yet hardy perennials keep coming back again and again. And he said that, in fact, if you look at the cycle of financial crises, whether it's the South Sea bubble in the 1700s, Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, and now today, I think you can see this remarkable sort of cycle of how financial crises work. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about that and see what we might take from that cycle. So Kindleberger actually drew on a guy called Hyman Minsky, who originally came up with the notion that there's predictable instability in all financial systems, right, in all credit systems. And he had this sort of cycle where he talked about 5 stages that credit cycles go through. He talked about displacement, boom, euphoria, profit-taking, and panic, right? Those are the 5 parts of the cycle. So let me kind of talk a bit about what that means. So the first idea is displacement, that inevitably in any financial cycle, crisis cycle, there's a sort of a period of time where there's some kind of new innovation, or people perceive something new that catches their fancy in economic terms. It could be anything, a new technology, some kind of new financial instrument. It could be new types of crops coming or commodities coming into the economic system and so on. But this displacement always kind of lulls investors into believing that they're seeing this totally new world, right? That our economy is becoming transformed by some kind of new, kind of exogenous thing that's come in. And we're in this new world where, the sort of money is growing on trees, and you just have to reach up and pluck it off, right? And everybody's going to be doing this. And you need to get in there into the orchard and, start plucking the money off, right? And so clearly I think you can think about this current crisis in this sense. And I think that one place you might start when thinking about this sort of displacement is with the notion of global imbalances. And here's this international part of the title of the talk a little bit, right? What do I mean by global imbalances? Well, as you know, the U.S. had a trade deficit that grew over time for the last couple decades. And we needed to finance this trade deficit because our love of flat screen TVs and so on and so forth. And we financed it with money from China and other countries that had very high savings rates, right? And they had trade surpluses. So they had extra money to lend. So we sort of sucked in this money, and it financed our trade deficit. And this is a sort of, this isn't anything nefarious. This is just balance of payments sort of accounting, right? Global imbalances have happened before. But this happened in a pretty extreme manner, right? Such that the capital comes in and it needs some place to go, right? It comes in and it basically creates incentives on the part of financial actors to dream up kind of new and different financial instruments to use to play with this money, right? And to bring people returns and so on. And so that's where we see this sort of growth of derivatives over time, right, that are building on the housing market and other parts of the real economy, right? And so you also have economists who are cleverly thinking up new and different ways to kind of figure out ways to price these various complex derivatives, right, and to deal with the risk that comes with derivatives. You've probably heard of the Black-Scholes model, which was developed out of the University of Chicago, right? And so economists are playing a role by kind of dreaming up ways in which various economic actors can kind of take these models and use them to feel secure that even though they're using these new complex derivatives and so on, they can figure out where they are in terms of risk and so on. So the stage is set for the second part of the cycle, this boom, monetary expansion, right? There's this era of expansion of bank lending and credit and so on, and people start getting crazy and buying on the margin, taking out loans to make new investments and so on and so forth. There's a personal credit boom, right? The United States, we all sort of load up on our personal debt. And the rising values, which continue coming along as everybody keeps pouring money in, both from abroad and domestically, means that we then move into this period of euphoria, right? With ever higher profits, everybody wants to join in. The sense of risk and the sense that it might all fall apart is somehow off the stage at this point, right? There's overtrading speculation. My favorite kind of version of this is turning on HGTV, and they actually had a program called Flip This House, right, where you could buy a house and fix it up, or maybe not even, just wait a couple months in Miami or what have you, and then sell it again, right? So everybody's sort of having so much fun and on board with this. And so Kindleberger talks about this as a mania. He really talks about how at this point in, historically in every financial crisis, it's as if people are possessed, right? There's this kind of frenzy that goes on, right? And he also notes, Kindleberger notes, that this is the stage where you see the amazing swindlers and frauds come out, right? Because they're ready to pick off people who have sort of bought into this, fairy tales and unicorns vision of sort of how the financial markets work. And it's fascinating if you go back and look at sort of the run-up to 1929 and you read about Mr. Ponzi and his schemes in Florida real estate and so on, the words Bernie Madoff are just sort of right there on the page in front of you. So what's striking, though, of course, about this particular financial crisis is that this process of the mania and the bubble, of course, does have an international component, right? You see a Wisconsin school board buying these credit default swaps, these new types of derivatives from Icelandic banks, right? You see Iceland itself basically becoming a hedge fund, right? And so you see the ways in which this phenomena that's going on inside the United States reaches its tentacles out by willing actors who are all part of this cycle. But one thing I do want to caution is that this sort of internationalization of the credit crisis is actually itself nothing new. If you go back and read Trollope's wonderful novel, The Way We Live Now, they talk about how it's set in the end of the 19th century, how the sort of elites of London, the political elites, the artistic elites, the financial elites, they're all investing in this land scheme in California, in this fictional account, right? And there's this, again, the same kind of mania and frenzy and so on and so forth. So these things are truly our hardy perennials, and the economy has been globalized and internationalized before. But I think the level of complexity of the financial derivatives is probably something truly new. Okay, so we're having lots of fun. It's euphoria. It's so on and so forth. But the idea here is that, in fact, of course, it is a bubble. It will pop, right? And so at the top of the cycle, you start to see this profit taking, right? Savvy insiders start to take their money out because they start to see that this is, in fact, what it is, right? It's a euphoric bubble and it can't actually last. And so, we start to see the rumblings. Bear Stearns goes under last spring, right? I was teaching a class in international political economy, and I sort of read about it and thought about it. I thought, well, that doesn't sound very good, but put it out of my mind. Well, surely everything will be all right. So I'm as guilty as anyone in this. So people start to sort of take their money out, and then the sort of euphoria starts to turn into a panic, right, as more and more people start to believe that, in fact, the bubble is about to burst. You have a rush for liquidity, right? People try to cash in and unwind these positions, and the panic turns into a full-blown crisis. Kindleberger talks about revulsion at this point, right, from euphoria to revulsion, that people can't sort of get out fast enough, and we're all sort of horrified and anxious. And if things are bad enough, and if the crisis is actually a big enough part of the economy, as this one has been, you start to see a spillover into the real economy, right? You start to see industries contracting. You start to see the economy contracting, unemployment increasing, and so on and so forth, and a period of retrenchment, right? Kindleberger observes, however, that you go through this cycle, you have the period of retrenchment, but there happens to be this sort of amnesia effect after a few decades where people start to sort of forget about this experience and off you go again, right? So this is the notion that these financial instabilities are hardy perennials and come again and again. But it leaves us with a puzzle, or at least leaves me with a puzzle. And in a really sort of basic level, we might ask sort of, well, how can we be so stupid again and again, right? A more scholarly way of asking that, it might be sort of, how should we think about human beings as rational actors, and yet they seem to get themselves into these situations which end up really being incredibly destabilizing for the economy as a whole and end up hurting many, many people. Why do we keep doing this? Well, we might imagine, it's just human nature, right? Social scientists don't like human nature very much because it doesn't vary enough. We can't really get leverage out of it to explain things, right? Although I've been thinking a lot about human nature, I'd like to hear your comments. But it's very clear that we need to understand the sort of social and cultural context under which this happens. How is it that actually we see this kind of psychology take hold? And now I'm going to go to my sort of second category of things, which is more on this sort of theoretical side. And I want to tell you about how I think about markets in general and financial markets. And it might help us a little bit to not be so surprised maybe when we see these cycles. I want to argue that, in fact, the nature of financial assets and money more generally, we have to remember, is that they exist only as what sociologists call social facts, right? They're socially constructed phenomena. Unlike goods and services, you can drop a good on your foot and so on and so forth. You can go get a service, get your hair cut, your hair is cut. The existence of these financial assets is purely subjective, right? Let me kind of unpack this a little bit. So what do I mean when I say markets are social facts or financial markets are social facts? So one of the theorists of this idea is a guy called John Searle, and he talked about how there are brute facts in the world, such as the distance of the sun from the earth. But there are also a lot of social facts in the world, such as the fact that Hillary Clinton is the U.S. Secretary of State, right? Social facts only exist because there are human institutions that call them into being, right, that make them meaningful. So for us to talk about Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State means that we all have to agree that there's this system of governance, the U.S. government, and so on and so forth, right? Lovely examples of this are things like marriage or football, right? They only exist because of the kind of social institutions, the rules, the understandings that allow us to think about them as facts, right? We still have football, we have a football, but it only becomes meaningful because of the kind of edifice of the social institution that we create. But remember, just because they're social and not material, it doesn't mean somehow that they don't matter or that they're easily sort of changed, right? Because they take on the kind of status of conventions. Like, so we talk about the stock market. We all talk, the stock market's up today, it's down today, the stock market is nervous today. And those things, it's like an animal. It wakes up in the morning, and some days it's, a bit nervous, and other days it's scampering about and happy. But, nobody sort of says, what are you talking about the stock market? It doesn't exist. We all accept it as a convention, right? Stocks exist as pieces of paper, certificates that we give to each other when making transactions. But remember, the stock market certificate just represents the stock. It doesn't actually make the stock in the sense that it's our expectations about the value of that stock that really give it meaning and make the stock market work, right? So you can think about financial markets as a series of these social facts, right? Derivatives, credit default swaps, credit, all these things that we wish we didn't know what they were, that we all know about. Bernie Madoff's, right, returns. They were all social facts that collapsed when people stopped believing in them, right? As an aside, I don't know, am I running out of time? I didn't bring my watch. As an aside, one of the fascinating things about the Madoff scandal is people are trying to figure out how much money did he lose, right? So people, I think, invested about like $12 billion or something like that in actual, currency invested in, but he purportedly sort of made about $60 billion for them, right? So how much money did he really lose, since he actually didn't make any money for them? That was all fantasy, right? He wasn't actually investing their money. How much money was actually lost in that incident? It really demonstrates, I think, the sort of social quality of financial markets when we think about it that way. Okay, so this is all very airy-fairy and academic and very nice and, all that kind of stuff. But sort of, why does this really matter? Why should this be more than of just academic interest? Well, I think if we remember that financial markets are socially constructed and that it's a world that really is about social facts, not material things, it helps explain why financial markets act the way Kindleberger told us they do, why they go through these cycles again and again, right? That they're really created by our own ideas and are subject to these sort of cataclysmic failure when people lose confidence, right? When they stop sort of believing in the existence of these things as social facts, or when their ideas about what those things represent and what the assets are valued and so on fail. When you think about international trade, it really gives you a nice kind of contrast to this, right? International trade has a very different quality to it because the things that are traded, again, are tangible and material, right? So international trade, even though we actually may be seeing a lot more protectionism and so on and so forth, it's not subject to the same kind of really wild swings that we see on the financial side of the economy, right? Now, one question I asked myself as I was getting ready is, well, what can we say about the particular mix of sort of social attitudes and cultural things and ideas and kind of motivated interests that actors had that created this sort of toxic brew that we've seen over the last year or so? And I'm going to throw out a few, but I'm curious as to kind of what you see as some of the underlying things that were at work. I talked a bit already about complex financial models. I think that the development of kind of economic theories about how to price these various assets played a large role in calling them into being, right? The economists working on these things, Black-Scholes model, they didn't report on something that existed already, right? They weren't economists who were studying this is the way financial markets worked. Instead, they created models that then were used by private actors to create those markets, right? So I think they played a role, as one theorist has talked about, as an engine of these markets, not a camera just taking pictures of how the economy works. I think, obviously the fact that it appears that many of the CEOs and other managers in these various companies either didn't understand or couldn't understand the degree of risk involved, right? That played a huge role as well. The culture of Wall Street and potentially Main Street that privileged wealth creation over the last several decades, right, without a sense of the importance of creating the real economy. A friend of mine teaches at the Harvard B School and gave me a horrible data point, which I really don't like, which is the fact that apparently last year, 2008, 40% of his students in the Harvard B School graduating class went into the financial sector, right, 40%, which is a very large number. And the last time that large a number went into the financial sector was what year? 1928, exactly. Yet another parallel. And he's actually quite cheerful and thinks, oh, this is great because now we'll actually get them doing something useful and, with the collapse of the financial sector, we'll be better in the long run. Yeah. Well, in the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes said. All right, so culture of Wall Street. We can go on and on about that, where the sort of grotesque salaries and bonuses is part of, feeding into that cycle. Consumers, of course, should take some of this blame as well, right? There's plenty of blame to go around. The hysteria around consumption, home equity loans, et cetera, et cetera. Public agencies, we can talk about the role that various political actors played in allowing all of these things to happen and in many instances actually benefiting presumably from it. But I think what knit all this together, really, and if we think about the socially constructed nature of everything that was going on, was this sense of kind of a neoliberal commitment to what I think Stiglitz and other people have called market fundamentalism, that in fact markets are logical, that actually markets are rational, and that it makes sense to sort of back off and allow markets to work because ultimately they really are the most effective way of producing wealth and generating efficiency and so on and so forth, right? And obviously that philosophy, there's a whole school of thought, efficient market hypothesis and so on, I think did a lot of work undergirding the kind of creation of social facts that we saw in this last cycle. And so we need to kind of think carefully about the role that those types of ideas play. All right, finally, let me throw some things out about international dimensions to this crisis and what does all this stuff about social facts and crisis maybe tell us about what's going on the international side. I think the most interesting and ironic, paradoxical thing about all this is the crisis has demonstrated the continuing central role of the United States in the world economy and the world geopolitical system, right? The kind of return to the dollar that we've seen, the strengthening of the dollar, has been quite remarkable. If you kind of think about the difficulties of the American economy, but not so surprising if you think about the notion that the U.S., as the sort of hegemonic actor of the international system, is really a focal point for investors, right? There's really a sense of sort of they are the only large political entity that can actually act as a lender of last resort, that has the capacity to stabilize the international system, that is the appropriate place for people to invest, even despite all the various difficulties. I've written a ton of stuff about how the euro won't displace the dollar anytime soon, and I'm delighted that that stuff is in print and apparently appears right, at least for the moment. So we can talk about that in Q&A. What else might we want to think about in terms of the international system? Well, I think the biggest question mark really is whether the U.S. will provide leadership to reinvigorate the global financial architecture and the sets of global institutions out there. If we think back to the sort of creation of the entire Bretton Woods system that today still stands as the various international institutions and so on that oversee the international economy, albeit timidly perhaps, those institutions were all set up right after World War II, when the U.S. was in this very unique position of both having a lot of geopolitical power, right? It had half of the GDP and had come out victorious after the world wars, but also had a sense of purpose of creating that international system in a way that allowed for international economic transactions, trade, financial integration, and so on, but also allowed for a lot of domestic stability, protection against some of these more wild swings of markets, right? Keynes was very worried about speculation, hot money, so on and so forth. So he actually built into the Bretton Woods system a lot of capital controls and ability for states to put up barriers to trade and capital flows when necessary, right? So John Ruggie has talked about this as embedded liberalism, that in fact you had liberalism, you had international markets, but they were embedded within these domestic political goals and norms. What I wonder about today, when I think about the moment that we're at now and whether we need to reconfigure those international institutions, where they are today, if we've gone too far on the neoliberal front and so on and so forth, I wonder whether the U.S. is really at a moment when it's going to be able to sort of take on that mantle of leadership. I believe it still has the power, actually, but I'm not completely sure that I understand exactly what our kind of illuminating sense of social purpose is, how we're actually going to rejigger those institutions. But I think we have to keep trying, right? Because even though we know from Minsky and Kindleberger and other folks that these financial crises appear again and again, they're hardy perennials, I think it really behooves us to think as hard as we possibly can, right, about trying to figure out ways to further stabilize both our domestic economy and the international system going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor McNamara. I can't help making the comment that one of the interesting questions is who gets to create the social facts.
Yes.
And by one view, governments are supposed to create the social facts. And so the question at some level is what some of the governments that are involved might be doing. And, of course, there is the issue that in some parts of the world it's not quite clear who the government is. not just in the failed states, but actually in Europe it can get rather difficult to tell who the relevant government is. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Kaltenhaler.
Very nice segment.
Hi, I'm Karl Kaltenhaler. Thanks for having me. This is obviously a topic that I find very interesting. I've been researching this a lot lately, and it makes me really think about why economists refer to their profession as the dismal science. It's a fairly depressing topic. I want to look at the European Central Bank in the European financial crisis. And I want to look at 4 questions today that could be kind of starting points for a discussion about the European Central Bank or the ECB's role in the crisis that Europe is facing now. The first question I want us to think about is, what has been the European Central Bank's policy mandate? What is kind of the driving directive for the central bank? The second question I want to think about is, what are the policy challenges facing the European Central Bank today? Okay, what are the big issues that it has to try to tackle? The third question I want to think about is, what are the ECB's policy options? What can it do to try to deal with these challenges that it faces today? And then finally, and this is the question that's really most interesting for me because I'm a political scientist, what are the politics of going forward for the ECB? In other words, how does the ECB deal with its internal politics and decide on what the best options are for going forward to deal with these challenges? So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about the ECB's policy mandate. Some of you may or may not know that the ECB is modeled very closely on the German Bundesbank, and that has to do with European power politics when the whole European Maastricht Treaty was designed, but it also has to do with best practices, that a lot of European central bankers were convinced that the German Bundesbank model had been the best practicing model in Europe, and so they decided to go along with those best practices.
What is the model again?
The Bundesbank, the German central bank. Okay. The German central bank, which created basically in 1957, had a very strict mandate, which was to maintain price stability, which is what I'm going to get into in a minute here. The ECB's mandate is almost a carbon copy of the German Bundesbank. The bank is to maintain price stability, which means low inflation. Okay? It doesn't have the kind of joint mandate that the American Federal Reserve has, growth and price stability. It's price stability. Okay? And the reason for this was that the thinking in the Bundesbank was that low inflation is the foundation of a healthy economy. Everything flows from a low inflation rate. And this is very much monetarist in its inspiration. We can get into monetarism more if you want to in a few minutes, but it has a lot to do with the thinking of Milton Friedman. Okay? So this mandate has really guided the central bank since its creation in 1999. And the central bank has been fairly successful in carrying out its task of maintaining price stability in Europe. And so a lot of people in the European Central Bank think that price stability really has been a solid foundation. You've had low inflation in Europe. You've had relatively solid growth until recently. And you've had a strong currency. The euro, which is the currency of the Eurozone, the member states that have adopted it, has been a strong currency. And as Kate was saying, some people wondered if the euro would eventually actually take the place of the U.S. dollar as kind of the anchor currency of the international system. Hasn't happened yet. Probably won't happen for a while or at all. Okay? But this mandate has been looked at as basically a guide to success within the European Central Bank. Now, what about the policy challenges that the European Central Bank faces today? There are really a whole series of policy challenges that the European Central Bank faces. Some of them very similar to the policy challenges that our American Federal Reserve faces here, but some are quite different because of the nature of the market in Europe. One obvious policy challenge is that the Eurozone is in a deep recession, and it's a deepening and profound recession. It's not even across all the members of the Eurozone, which makes it difficult to make monetary policy across the Eurozone in some ways. But every country in Europe who's part of the Eurozone really is doing badly. Some of them are doing very, very badly and have what we could call pretty extreme market dysfunction. Countries that would fall into that category, in my opinion, would be countries like Ireland, Greece, Spain. Okay? But a country which is very worrying in terms of its economic trajectory right now is Germany. Germany is the largest economy in the Eurozone. To a degree, it's the locomotive of the Eurozone. and Germany's economic picture looks pretty bleak. Okay? If Germany goes down, you can pretty much expect that the rest of the Eurozone is going to be profoundly affected by that. So that's one big issue, this deepening recession and market dysfunction. Another issue, and this is very controversial within the European Central Bank, is the potential for deflation. Deflation is kind of drops in prices across the economy that persist for a while over time. Different people argue that it's a period of months, could be years, so people disagree about how long prices have to drop in order for it to be deflation. But there is the potential for deflation to occur within the Eurozone. The Eurozone definitely is in what we call disinflation right now. In other words, prices are dropping. The question is, when does disinflation become deflation in this kind of profound process of prices dropping? Why should we care about deflation? Why is this a big issue? And this is an issue within the United States as well, something we need to think about. Deflation robs people of wealth. It robs people of the ability to purchase things in the economy. And it's also got a pretty profound psychological impact. If people think that their net value is decreasing, they're going to be less willing to spend in the economy. This isn't just consumers like you and I, but it's also businesses and various other actors within the economy. If they're convinced that their value is decreasing, then they're going to hold back on spending, and you get this kind of cycle that develops where deflation makes the recession worse, the recession makes deflation worse, and you go on and on and on. I say this is a controversial thing because there are some people in the European Central Bank who are quite concerned about deflation. There are others who are not concerned about the deflation. They think the disinflation that's occurring in Europe is a temporary thing, and that actually Europe's worries should be more focused on inflation in the short term. We can get into that in a minute, which is kind of an interesting debate. Another problem that the European Central Bank faces, and this is kind of Elliot's purview more than mine, is that there's no single bank regulator in Europe. The European Central Bank does not have the power to regulate all the banks within the Eurozone. And this is a problem for the European Central Bank. It's a problem because they don't have really control over what goes on with these banks. That's left up to national regulators. But it's also a big problem for the European Central Bank in that they get what they consider incomplete and sometimes faulty information from banks. And the European Central Bank is convinced that if they don't have as complete and accurate as possible information about what's going on with banks, how can they possibly try to deal with the banking crisis that Europe is facing as we are? Okay. All right, so let's talk about policy options. What can the European Central Bank do to fix the mess that Europe finds itself in? A deep recession, at least disinflation, and a banking crisis that's becoming more and more profound. Well, one thing that a lot of people watch is obviously the interest rate policy of the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is a little behind the United States in terms of lowering its interest rates. The chief interest rate that people follow for the European Central Bank is now at 1.5%. Okay? I don't know how much you follow American interest rates now, but our interest rate is effectively zero right now. Okay? They're 1.5%. The expectation next month when they meet is that they will drop down to 1%, but that's kind of a magic number or a threshold number for the European Central Bank because there's a big divide, and I'm going to get into this more in a minute, within the European Central Bank about how much farther you go down below 1%. There's a philosophical policy debate that's going on in the European Central Bank right now of whether you go below 1% to zero like we've got in the U.S., or 1% is the absolute basement and you don't go below that. And that'll make more sense in a minute. Another policy option for the European Central Bank is to take a larger role in bank supervision. And the European Central Bank has taken a public stance saying that they want a larger role in bank supervision. The problem with that is the politics within the European Union of handing that power over to the European Central Bank. National governments like to regulate their own banking systems. They don't want to hand that power over to the ECB. And if we look at what's going on in Europe right now, I wouldn't expect the ECB to take over banking supervision in the near term. It may become a necessity. Elliot's probably got some thoughts on that. But right now, we do not see that power being totally handed over. consequently, there's also a debate within the ECB. There isn't total consensus within the ECB as to whether that would be a good idea. There are some dissenters on that. The other policy option, and this is by far the most controversial policy option within the ECB, and has really become a political issue for the central bank, is the issue of going to what it's known as quantitative easing. This is moving away from interest rate policy into a whole new realm of central bank activity. We in the United States, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, have gone to a zero interest rate and have begun, like the Bank of England has begun, a process of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is basically the idea where you print money and then go into the markets and buy securities with that money. The object of that is to inject money into the money supply to get more cash moving so that you stimulate the economy. Okay? If you can't do it with interest rates, obviously if interest rates are zero, you can't go below that, then you possibly go to this quantitative easing, which is essentially printing money to stimulate the economy. Okay? This is a hugely, hugely controversial issue within the bank. So the politics of going forward, what does this look like for the ECB? As I've been saying in my talk so far, there are some profound divisions within the European Central Bank over what to do. And I like to think of the division as principally between two groups. They wouldn't call themselves this, but this is my moniker for them. You've got what I would call the Bundesbankers, people who think of the German central bank as their model, and then the dissenters. Okay, so you've got these two groups who are battling it out within the European Central Bank, but also publicly in the press, which is unheard of until recently. So what does this mean? The Bundesbankers are the group of people who basically think that the European Central Bank needs to maintain its focus on price stability. And it needs to make sure that it doesn't do anything in the short term that will damage Europe's long-term economy. And here's how the Bundesbank group within the ECB thinks. They think that if the ECB gets involved in quantitative easing, if they start printing money to try to get the economy moving again, they're going to create the foundations for inflation within Europe. And then when the economy gets back on its feet, and this Bundesbank group within the ECB actually thinks that the European economy will get back on its feet in 2010, then the ECB is going to have to fight this big problem of inflation. Okay, so they're saying, yeah, this is a temporary downturn. It's an ugly downturn, but it will only be temporary, and then we'll have to deal with this problem of inflation. So these people are saying no to quantitative easing. Now, it's important to note who a couple of these people are, because who they are really matters to what power they have within this policy debate. One of the people, and probably the most important of the Bundesbank group, is Jürgen Stark, who is the chief economist of the European Central Bank. He's one of the governing council. He's on the executive board of the European Central Bank. Now, why is he important? Jürgen Stark is important because the chief economist is really the most important single molder of policy within the European Central Bank. It's not the president of the European Central Bank. The president of the European Central Bank is the public face of the central bank, but it's really the chief economist who's the person that controls the policy agenda more than anyone else. Okay? They're the ones that compile the economic data. They are the ones who control the agenda at the governing council meetings. They play a huge role in determining what policy is. Jürgen Stark is a very conservative, even by Bundesbank standards, which means he's really, really conservative, monetarist. This is a guy who was vice president of the Bundesbank before he came into the European Central Bank, okay, and now really is a vocal advocate for this very German approach to central banking. The other person who you could probably guess is the president of the Bundesbank, Axel Weber, who has also been a very vocal and public critic of the idea of quantitative easing. Okay. Now others, most importantly, the president of the little central bank of Cyprus, have come out and said that we need quantitative easing. So you've got this public debate in the press between members of the governing council of the ECB over what to do. Now, why does that matter? You know, we in the United States are somewhat used to transparency. In the Federal Reserve, you can go look at the minutes, you can see what the debates are, things like that. European Central Bank has a very different culture. The minutes are not public. they always have, or until recently have, basically the notion that everyone is to sing from the same song sheet, that there were not to be public discussions of policy. In fact, the European Central Bank always said they never even had votes in the governing council because everything was done by consensus. Everyone always agreed on everything. And now you've got this situation where you've got governing council members arguing with each other through the press. Why is that consequential? Well, one reason it's consequential is it has an effect on markets. Markets look at this and say, who's speaking for the European Central Bank? What is the policy of the European Central Bank? What's the way forward? Even those of us who don't focus that much on economics know that markets don't react real well to uncertainty. If people don't know the future direction of European Central Bank policy, it's going to have some negative effects. Now, another thing that I think is probably even more important than how this could affect markets in the short term is that this lack of consensus within the European Central Bank on what to do means that the central bank is going to be fairly paralyzed. That without a consensus on how to move forward, the European Central Bank will do kind of a plodding, go slow strategy to try to get the economic crisis in Europe solved. The problem with that is that they may end up doing too little too late. Now, one thing that some people have raised in the media and political scientists have raised this too is this public battle indicative of a potential breakup of the Eurozone? And I'll go out on a limb, I think I'm pretty safe on this, to say no, this does not indicate a breakup of the ECB or the Eurozone. The cost of that would be much too great for the European countries involved. What we'll probably have is just a gradual reaction of the European Central Bank to this crisis, maybe to the detriment of the European economy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl. I'm struck by a couple of things by that presentation. One is that while people in markets seem to forget the past, I don't think Germans do. And there's obviously an event in the German past that has something to do with these attitudes, namely the great inflation after the First World War. The second thing that occurs to me is this. Here you see an example of some of the differences between the European situation and the American situation, which is in the U.S., it is possible for the central bankers to sit down with other government officials who have control of other government policies, and that doesn't appear to be quite the same kind of option in the EU, or maybe Professor Posner can tell us otherwise.
That's right. Yeah, you would think not. Thanks, Joe. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming today and to say what an honor it is to be on a panel with two such distinguished scholars. I'm going to use my time, and I'll be brief, to address the other side of the European response to the financial crisis. So here the question isn't how to stabilize the current mess we're in. It's really about what rules are appropriate to put in place to make sure it doesn't repeat itself in the future. So I'm looking at European regulatory responses to the crisis. I have been following European financial regulatory changes now for 5 years, and I think at this moment there's three interesting questions. So I'm going to address these questions now. But before I do, I just want to say that I think two major themes run through what I think are appropriate answers or the right answers to these questions. And the themes go something like this. The European countries who belong to the European Union have been trying to meld together their financial systems for 40, 50 years. It's been slow going. There's been periods like right after the euro's introduction when things really sped up. So you've got this long process going on. It's been incremental, building, cumulative, I would say. And it's had different drivers at different times. Sometimes it's driven by firms interested in lowering costs of business across borders within Europe. Sometimes it's the desire to have bigger markets to compete with the Americans, the U.S. challenge. And sometimes, like now, it's about just the necessities of prudential regulation being the kind of regulation that seeks to reduce, to minimize the risks of one firm's problems becoming everybody's problems, kind of stuff we're having now. So that's one of the themes that runs through the regulatory process in Europe. The other one is what I would call political constraints, and there really are two. One is our classic questions of sovereignty, that finance and the supervision of banks is, countries are really sensitive about letting others handle it for reasons that we're seeing now in the press. And so that's just been a constant. And then the other one is that for some reason, well, it's not a random reason, but for reasons that I don't want to go into, finance has become one of these places where the institutions inside the European Union fight out their balance of power battles. So there's the European Parliament, the European Commission, which is Brussels bureaucrats, and now the ECB, as well as the member governments. They all sort of, over these financial debates, also seem to be fighting out who's, turf wars within the European Union. So now let me turn to these three questions. The first one goes like this. Before the crisis, why hadn't the Europeans put more pressure on the American market authorities to adopt more rigorous forms of regulation? We sometimes think of European styles of capitalism, and images of social models come to mind, risk-averse type of capitalist systems. So why didn't they do this? And the background here, the relevant background here, is that there's a lot of evidence showing that the European efforts to reform their own regulatory system about 10 years ago gave them a lot of bargaining power, bargaining leverage vis-a-vis American authorities in these organizations where sort of the rules of the game of international finance get set. Well, what did the Europeans do with this new power? They rather than push some sort of European social model onto the Americans, they were really concerned about leveling the playing field, making sure that European firms had equal access to U.S. markets on the same terms that American firms had. That's really what their agenda had been all about. So why was this the case? Well, here I think that the answer lies in what happened inside Europe 10 years ago, when they really did manage to put together a European-level regulatory system where governments gave up quite a bit of their authority and towards and put it in Brussels-based systems, rule-making systems. But in doing so, they had this problem, this constant problem in European politics of you can't have a French system, you can't have, if you're going to have a system for all of Europe, it can't look like the French system, can't look like the German system, can't look like the UK system. So in finance, unlike in other areas of regulation like data privacy, they adopted principles that were being developed in international organizations, which were considered kind of neutral. International accounting standards, international principles for regulating conglomerates, this sort of thing. And these international forums had been dominated by U.S. authorities for decades. So basically, when it came to finance in Europe, they adopted more or less an American-style system. So that's number one. And by the way, so if in playing the blame game, I guess if you follow the logic here, then some of the blame might actually rest in the European Union for the current crisis. Second, my second question has to do with the current clash over the international agenda for dealing with the crisis. If you've been reading the press about the run-up to the G20 meeting, which is going to be, I guess, in 2 weeks, you'll know that there's been a clash over the United States and European governments over priorities. The United States wants to focus on coordinating economic stimulus packages, whereas Europeans want to prioritize regulatory reforms. So why do the Europeans have these priorities? Well, I think understanding some of the politics inside of the EU also helps us figure this one out too. For those of you who know about Europe, you know that cooperation over fiscal areas has been really not very successful in Europe. They don't share a tax regime. There's very little in terms of Brussels' ability to raise taxes. So this makes stimulus packages hard at the European level. They have to coordinate. They haven't been able to, if you read the press, you know, they haven't done such a good job at coordinating. But on the other hand, as I just mentioned, they've been kind of successful over the last decade, slow but successful, in getting their regulatory act together. And so for this reason, it's much easier for them to coordinate an international position on these things. Now, I should say one thing here that I alluded to before, that one of the reasons that they've been so successful is because they've done another European Union thing, which is to go for the easier areas, the low-lying fruits first, and keep sort of the more sensitive issues off the table and push it into the future. Here, it's important to note that prudential regulation, which is now center stage, was off the table 10 years ago. That was left to national governments to deal with themselves. But now with the crisis, this is all changed, and this leads to my third question, which so the third question has to do with what are they doing now? Because actually, if you read the press, you'll notice that in the United States, we're waiting for the Barney-Franks bill, but it seems like the U.S. regulatory, what's in store for the U.S. in terms of changes to our regulatory system have taken a back seat to the stimulus packages and bringing stability to markets. But in Europe, actually, the regulatory plans are quite far along. So the question I want to ask now is, why have they come up with this kind of complex, well, they haven't decided on anything yet, but they've now focused in on a report by Jacques de la Rosière. It's called the de la Rosière report, and this has now become the focal point for discussions of where European regulation should go. So in some ways, they're quite ahead of the U.S. And so, but instead of proposing a very elegant model, which some critics wanted to see, which would be the equivalent of a single authority over Europe, they're having the proposals, the recommendations are all kind of, they seem like imperfect compromises, which is exactly what they are, because the same old politics that I mentioned before are with us again. It's very, very difficult for the Europeans to agree to, say, an SEC of Europe, or a Fed-like structure that would cover all of Europe. So I won't go into details about what they proposed, but I will say that because this is the crisis, we're in a crisis mode, and they need to address prudential regulation. So most of the important changes will be in the area of prudential regulation. There will be the central bank, ECB, is getting more power. This is something 10 years ago that was completely off the table, but the ECB now will, Trichet, the president of the ECB, will oversee a new body that will be kind of like a systemic risk warning system with all the central banks on the council. And then also, rather than create an SEC of Europe, which continues to be a non-starter in Europe, there will be a second new body that will build on what was there before. It's comprised of committees of national regulators, and the idea is to give it more power, the old system, a little bit more power to oversee implementation and supervision. So that's where we are with European regulation right now, and I think I'll stop there and open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Elliot. We are trying to record this, so if you have a question, I'd much appreciate it if you would go to the microphone and pose the question. That'll give me a moment to actually ask a question of the group here. It seems to me that the way Elliot has set it up is there's two kinds of responses, or maybe if you include Karl, there's three kinds of responses. There's a monetary response, There's to essentially problems within the banks, or problems within the financial system. There's a stimulus response to the fact that as a result of what's happened, you have just a sort of second order but extremely large problem with demand. And then there's a regulatory response, which is based on the fact that at some level people do not have a whole lot of confidence in the financial institutions, and we need some reassurance about the financial institutions. And a regulatory structure would give people more assurance. On the other hand, a lot of these institutions are half dead now. And creating a new set of regulations on them will probably just reveal that they're half dead, which is what everybody's scared of. So, and a large part of the response, I would think, needs to be somehow figuring out how dead the various institutions are, which ones to rescue, how to rescue them, what you do about the assets that are on their books. Now, in the United States, this is hard enough, okay? But how do you do it for Banque Nationale Paribas or whoever? You know, how do you do it for a French or a German bank, which has God knows what on its books? So, what is the process for working out the institutions? Are they having a hard enough time working out Citigroup? But is there any way of doing this within the European context? Is it the Germans' problems for the German banks, the French problem for the French banks, or what? And again, please, somebody else go to to be the next question. But
do you want to take a swing at it?
Let me, yes, because the EU, because of these political constraints that I talked about, they often come up with very interesting regulatory and governance devices, sort of innovations. And all the rage now is this thing called the colleges of supervisors, where it's a very European idea that since you don't have central authority over all these countries to do what you'd like to do, you have to come up with second best devices. And so this is to put all the national supervisors that oversee a particular firm. So if there's a firm that's based in France and has operations in London and Poland and Hungary and the United States, you get all the supervisors in the same room. And there's actually a set of rules about how whose authority trumps, in each case. And they have to sit and hash things out and share. They have to share information. Because part of the problem in Europe is that there are incentives for national regulators not to share with other national regulators. So they're working on it. It's really imperfect. By the way, you'll see that this is one of the European proposals at the G20 that seems to have some legs. They want to sell this to the world as a way to regulate firms. Cross-border firms that operate globally.
Anybody else want to add to that one, or perhaps speculate on the question of what happens if where do the Americans fit into this story? Once you throw in the Americans, because of course, the French bank probably has a bunch of crappy American assets and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the points that your comments bring up is this whole question about, how do you price these toxic assets, right? And how do you decide what their value is? And, efforts to sort of think about auctions and creating a market, that all fell apart in the U.S. Sort of early on. Now they're on the stress tests for the American banks and so on and so forth. But, I think that clearly these things still have not yet been worked out. And I think, when we think about that multiplied into a European setting with all these different national banking systems and national banking cultures and so on and so forth, it just makes it more difficult to think of how to coordinate that at the European level.
Do we need to have a certain kind of asset from a certain pool have the same valuation by both the European and the American regulators? Or if you don't, do you have arbitrage issues?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nice twist, yeah.
Yeah.
Ken Grundy.
Thank you. My question, I guess, is for Professor McNamara, but I really appreciate all of you jumping in. Professor McNamara asked the question, how can we be so stupid? To which my response is, what do you mean we?
Yeah. Very nice, yes.
We poor schlemiels had very little to do with this, and yet it was powered by ambitious, greedy people who thought they could make something out of nothing, practically. Now, my computer has a gadget called a firewall, which protects me from, I think, which protects us from these sorts of things. And yet, what happened to the firewalls between various sorts of financial instruments and various sorts of financial institutions that had been in place, but maybe were incomplete for a modern day? And what is being done to reconstruct something akin to a firewall to protect us from this kind of action?
That's a really great point. And I've been, as I suppose everyone here has been following the AIG bonuses thing very closely, because I think it really is the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of what it reveals about the winners and losers of this financial crisis, right? And also, sadly, what it reveals about how our democratic political system is responding to it, right? And what really troubles me, perhaps as much as the crisis itself, is what it does indicate about who the we is, right? And how it was that we collectively got ourselves into a situation where, the foxes were watching the chickens, perhaps. And I think what is so stunning to me is how tone deaf people like Larry Summers and Geithner have been to, I think, completely reasonable, actually quite rational and logical, as well as moral backlash that comes when the folks that perpetrate these incredibly bad decisions that have had repercussions across the economy are not held accountable for them. And that, is, I think, we have a long way to go to address this question of how did we get involved in this, I think we've heard voices. Actually, Robert Reich has a little piece on, I have to admit it, I read Huffington Post. He has a little piece on the Huffington Post today where he talks about that how have we built a democratic system that actually is so bad on the financial side at protecting the folks that are supposed to be represented. So I share your discomfort and outrage, actually. Yeah.
As does Larry Summers, if you watch him on The Daily Show and so on. Professor Andreas
Can
Sobish.
I just say one quick thing? Is that, so the history of this is starting to come out now. And one thing that we've learned, because one of our colleagues at MIT has written about this, is that these were deliberate decisions were made by U.S. regulators, the SEC in particular, in the early 90s. They saw the derivatives markets as a competitive advantage of our financial firms vis-a-vis European and Asian firms. And so there was efforts in the early 90s to make investment banks fall under the Basel Accords, so that they would have to have the same capital cushion as regular banks. Now, I don't know if that would have changed what outcome we have today, but you can trace it back to deliberate decisions made by our own officials.
And
including Congress, I might add, right?
And if I understand correctly, of course, what's going on is there's a flow of capital flying around out there, and the question is who's going to get the marginal fees that are generated off that flow of capital, and they want to get a hold of that flow of capital in the United States rather than somewhere else. This is obviously a major theme. Professor Sobish.
Thanks. Your answer, Professor McNamara, gave me an idea for a second question, so I'm going to ask that very quickly. As we discuss sort of the solutions and the regulatory reforms, do you think it's more important to act quickly and maybe get it sort of right, or take our time and get it right? If that's even possible, I don't know. By what standard we would decide that we've done it right? Probably wouldn't even know until the long run. My other question, my first original question was, I just got back from 2 weeks in Germany. I was surprised that the mood is still reasonably upbeat. It's far from as gloomy as it is in the United States. And that might be the answer to my question, which is, why is it that there is this disconnect between American and European politicians in terms of what we need to do. The Europeans, apparently, which is kind of bizarre, are much less Keynesian than the Americans. You know, we are pushing for stimulus packages, and the Europeans are putting on the brakes and acting more on the regulatory side. Which, if things are as bad as you say, Karl, why are the Germans not more aggressive on the stimulation side?
To a degree, you've answered your own question. Part of it is the German government doesn't want to get pushed into a Keynesian-type policy, and the output data in Germany is pretty grim, and the export data in Germany is pretty grim, and the business mood data is pretty grim, and so there's people who are looking at this and saying that the German economy seems to be on a trajectory downwards that could be very troubling. At the same time, the German government isn't saying the sky is falling the way that the American government is about our economy here. And part of that is that they don't want to be pushed politically, I think, into a major stimulus package the way we are here.
And we have elections coming up in Germany in the fall, which is kind of a surprise, right? Don't politicians love to prime the pump in the run up to an election and then worry about the consequences for inflation later?
Well,
if I'm a German politician, I want to make sure that the unemployment rate doesn't go up too badly, right? So I want to prime the pump and not do the opposite.
Well, there are social constructions of reality, and maybe they care more about...
Well, there are big concerns about the fiscal consequences of doing that Germany will dig itself a huge debt hole, deficit, and that this will be a big, big problem.
But they're still talking about balanced budgets for this year. I mean,
no,
this is
it's really striking.
Well, it's one thing the ECB stresses, that Europe can't throw away the Stability Pact rules.
Wow.
Can I push on this a bit before we get back to Andreas's first question for Professor McNamara? Do the Europeans have the capacity to borrow in the same way we do, in the same way the U.S. does? How much capital is out there? And which raises the question, maybe the reason we've been able to borrow at the rate we have is because the Germans and the French and the Europeans haven't been borrowing as much. Maybe you wouldn't have the same effects on our interest rates, the same lack of effect on our interest rates, if the Europeans were trying to borrow too, but maybe also some of the Europeans think that there's only so much capital out there and that you will have a rise in interest rates if they're borrowing. Do we know anything about this?
Do we? No, but of course that's never stopped me from talking, so I'll just plunge right in. So, I mean, on the German case, one thing that I've heard, and I don't know if you heard this when you were there, is that there was such sort of fatigue after the absorption of Eastern Germany and a sense that the German economy missed out on a lot of the growth that happened in the 90s and early 2000s. And so there's a sense that, we've seen this before. We don't want to get involved in, bailing out Central and Eastern Europe and seeing our economy, continue to get hit. And so we're going to sort of take a different path. I don't know if you'd heard that. But I think the other thing is, so the Europeans, their banks, and of course, you've probably heard about the Austrian banks and so on. There were certain banks in Europe that were as involved in all these shenanigans as we, but I think to a lesser degree overall. They actually their unemployment rate is not shooting up as fast. Many people say it's I guess it's the upside of market rigidity, labor market rigidity, is they're not being as immediate in terms of their unemployment. So maybe the political feedback hasn't been as immediate in that sense. They have much stronger social welfare states, so economic crisis will translate politically differently, right? And so stimulus may be less important in a situation where people have guaranteed health care and so on and so forth. So I think there are probably a bunch of political reasons why they've been slower to jump on the stimulus bandwagon, although it is ironic, right, since we tend to think of them as the big spending, Europeans. And your first question, I would say it's better to take time when it comes to regulating, actually, because I don't think the financial sector is going to rev up and go anywhere anytime soon. So I think we could probably take our time on the regulation side and try to do it right. I think right now my sense is in Washington, they're because of understaffing at the Treasury and just complete focus on trying to get the stimulus through, there hasn't been a lot of preparation for the London summit and so on and so forth. And I don't think they've focused much on regulation, but I think we unfortunately have a bit of time to do that. That's my sense.
Professor Hammack.
I just heard a reference to London, but I've heard almost nothing about the UK this afternoon. That's interesting in and of itself, but I did have the impression that London was an important financial center and wasn't totally integrated into the EU. When I go to Britain, I have to use pounds, I notice. I'd be interested in some comments.
Elliot's the guy.
I find this to be, one of the twists of the story here, because if you go to London, all you hear is about Brussels bureaucrats getting in the way of innovation and enterprise, and if they would just move aside, we could, thrive. But the fact,
or at least all you used to hear.
Yeah, this is what we used to hear. But I am utterly convinced that London's rise in the last, 5 or 10 years has been, which provoked a reaction in Washington, if you remember, just efforts to overturn Sarbanes-Oxley, the senators involved, Mayor Bloomberg was involved to catch up with London. So I'm utterly convinced that London's rise is due to efforts in the European Union to create a single regulatory regime. London is part of that. They're not part of the euro, but they bought into the regulatory apparatus, which means that something like 95% of the legislation and rules that get implemented in London originate in Brussels. Now, they're implemented still by national authorities, but those national authorities aren't free to do whatever they want. And so I guess what I'm saying is the battle, there had been this 25-year battle between Frankfurt and Paris and London over who was going to be the financial capital of Europe, and London just won. And these common harmonized rules really helped it excel.
I guess that raises a question about the role of the ECB versus the Bank of England and these kinds of things.
Well, this is what Karl said.
Getting everybody around the table it just reinforces your point, I guess. But maybe you want to
they're outside the Eurozone, as you pointed out. So the Bank of England meets with the other central bankers through the General Council. The ECB is looking at what they're doing in the UK right now to see if it's successful at all. Like I mentioned in my talk, the British have already engaged in quantitative easing, and so to a degree it's looked at as a test case to see how things are going. But they're in constant contact with each other about these things through the General Council and through informal channels as well.
And the pound is greatly devalued
Yeah.
compared to the euro as well. Right?
Yeah.
Right, the pound is greatly devalued compared to the euro. Yeah.
And so
Almost still not divided.
So this was the trick with coming up with the prudential regulatory mechanism in Europe, because you would, in the United States, our first impulse is, well, let's expand the powers of the Fed. In Europe, you couldn't do that because the center of finance wasn't part of the ECB. So they've done the next best thing is they've brought in this other body, given it more power, this other body that did include the Bank of England to be part of it. But it's still, I'm not sure, in the Financial Times reports that the UK is going along with this, but maybe they're not.
To a degree, but
to a degree.
I think you hit it on the head when you said, and I look at the European Union like this. It's a bunch of imperfect compromises, and I look at the structure for governing finance in Europe as to a great extent an imperfect compromise, and it's really coming to roost now. I think with Europe trying to deal with the crisis, and that you don't have really efficient mechanisms for dealing with this, particularly, like you said, when the biggest financial center in Europe is outside the Eurozone. So how does the ECB deal with that?
Well, it should be pointed out that regulation of the American financial institutions was not entirely within the Fed for many years. If it is now, the Fed was saying, hey, that's not really our job for some aspects of it. And secondly, I think it's fairly safe to say that many American public policies are imperfect compromises. Ed Fritz.
I'm one of these people who saw this coming. I'm not an economist. It was obvious to me when I first heard the term junk bonds, swaps. There were a whole lot of terms that even the New York Times couldn't define and figure out. And I just wonder, do you really want to reform these things, or do you want to abolish them, forbid them? That getting the financial section so far from the drywall and the physical realities feeding people and all that. It just seems to me, and then we add computers into this, that you can make things even more opaque by trading currencies, many times a day as they rise by a quarter of a point. All of that is just asking for fraud and instability. And I have another comment, but any comments on whether you would reform this stuff or try to?
I would seriously limit it. To be honest, I agree. I think there are a lot of things that actually don't produce more efficient markets in our economy and don't actually produce wealth. So, right. I mean, I would seriously rein a lot of it back. Yes.
My position has been that that there should be an FDA for financial instruments, that you should not be allowed to have a new financial instrument without it being approved as not harmful. And maybe having a couple of pilot tests on small amounts of it, because I think that there's some that when we think of regulation, we have to think of whether you let things happen and then come in and affect it, which is a sort of occupational safety and health administration model, or whether you say you can't do it unless we approve it first, which is the FDA model. Professor Hammack had a follow-up there.
I just want to ask whether the same question wasn't being asked in 1900 about the combination of grain futures and pork futures
That's right.
with the telegraph.
Right. No, that's right. But I mean,
so just in case that wasn't heard, the question is, didn't you have something similar happening in terms of technology and so on when you had grain futures and pork belly futures and the telegraph in 1900?
Yeah, but I think that that's exactly what they wrestled with when coming up with the Bretton Woods system, and I actually think they got the answer right. Keynes said that lawyers were the poets of Bretton Woods. Right? That in fact, because they were able to sort of design this system that hopefully would kind of, allow us to gain the benefits of capitalism but while shielding normal people from the worst excesses. And I think we need some new poets, frankly. So, you had another question as well?
Yeah, the other thing I think is at the backdrop of this crisis is just the difficulty of keeping the American economy going and the need to constantly borrow money so that these institutions right around us here can continue building, build. And there's no grassroots need for a lot of these institutions. I think the Wolstein Center down at CSU, they didn't want a new convocation center, but they were told by the state of Ohio, it's your turn to put up this year's high-rise or convocation center, what have you. And it just has reached a point where they have to borrow more and more to keep the economy going at all.
Well, there's a basic question about the nature of capitalism and having to generate more and more need so that there's a reason to produce something. And one of the things that's happening within the automobile industry is, the fact is that you don't really need a new car as often as people buy new cars. This one, that's maybe even bigger than anything you guys could address, but do you want to comment on the underlying crisis of capitalism? Or
Well, I would just say that there's a really interesting article in Vanity Fair this month by Michael Lewis, who wrote Liar's Poker a million years ago and one of the other crazy financial crises we've had. And it's about Iceland, and it's about how dramatically people changed their expectations of what the economy should do and how quickly it should grow and what kind of money people should make and how many Range Rovers they should have and how it all came crashing down. And why it's fascinating is because it occurs over this 5-year period or something, and it's in this tiny little place where the change was so dramatic in terms of how the economy ramped up and then crashed. And I think it's a microcosm of something that maybe went on in more subtle ways throughout the post-war era. And my big question is where will we be? How severe will this crisis be? And will people sort of change their cultural expectations about consumption and about keeping up with the Joneses and how many buildings to build and, So I still see porta potties in my neighborhood, which is a sign of social status. It means you're renovating. So I still see them. So I don't know.
I wanted to just say that, is it time? Yeah. Okay. Quickly then, I just wanted to, yes, the crisis of capitalism. If we just think about Europe, I think, okay, here's the crisis of the century. If there should be serious reforms of the capitalist system, I would expect it there. And yet I don't. The people I talk to, there's not the sense of crisis there that there is here, one. And two, I've spent the last couple of years as a good political scientist writing about these political constraints on change in Europe, and I thought for sure with this crisis that this would all go out the window, that things would become more fluid. But so far, they haven't. It's really surprising.
Yeah, one thing that you definitely see within the European Central Bank is this sense that let's not overreact to this. Let's not do something stupid. It's a crisis, but it's transitory. Let's not, the Americans look like they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to find a solution.
Can I ask my colleagues, what about all this doom and gloom about Central and Eastern Europe and kind of backlash within the EU on a political level? Is that something that is overblown?
No. I don't think it's overblown. I think there's pretty profound potential for damage to the financial system in the western part of Europe as a consequence of what's going on in Eastern Europe.
Okay.
And the Austrians lent how much into the rest of
It's not just
Europe?
the Austrians.
Yeah.
Well, okay, here's the thing, is I was sure a couple of days ago, I was very pessimistic on the status, on the condition of European banks, until I realized that where our money here was going through AIG, because this isn't the AIG, our taxpayer money bailing out AIG, a lot of it has gone to big European banks who bought their insurance policies. But this isn't just by accident. It's because of the European interpretation of the Basel Accords, which allowed banks in Europe to hold less capital if they had these AIG instruments, if they bought them.
Because AIG was the top-rated in the credit rating agencies, right?
Yeah, so we may actually end up saving.
So we're bailing out the Europeans, if not ourselves. And that, I guess, is the international dimension of the international financial meltdown. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming.